Hello and welcome to Tech Latest from Nikkei Asia, where we bring you the freshest updates from the technology sector in Asia. This special year-end episode will be co-hosted by myself, Akito Tanaka.
And Katey Creel.
Katey is our tech editor, and she pretty much edits all the tech stories that we publish on Nikkei Asia. And first of all, I would like to ask Katey, what are the good stories that we published? What are the popular stories that we published? And this year's theme, which also was last year's themes actually, was the supply chain. Are there any stories that you want to recommend to our readers that we published this year?
Yes, it's been a really busy year for supply chain stories and tech in general. As you said, a lot of continuity from previous years, largely because the US-China tensions and trade war that drove a lot of the previous supply chain shifts are still in place and arguably increased over the year. How that will play out next year is anyone's guess. But for now, there's been a lot of shifting away from China, getting production into Southeast Asia, ramping up exports ahead of expected tariff deadlines. So we've seen a big impact on the tech industry from geopolitics. I think one of the most interesting stories we've had was how the shift to kind of not only away from China, but away from Taiwan for chip making has been a boon for places such as Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand. So in Malaysia, which was actually up until a couple of decades ago, one of Asia's leading chip industries and chip economies, they kind of fell by the wayside as Korea, Japan, and Taiwan rose in their capabilities and competitiveness. But with tensions between not only US and China, but Taiwan and China, a lot of companies have been looking to have kind of a China plus one or just more diverse production. And Malaysia's seen this as an opportunity. They're welcoming investment, trying to boost their workforce and really just become, once again, the Silicon Valley of the East.
Yeah, I agree, totally agree. And another thing that we saw was an investment in Japan, where the semiconductor has been sort of dying for decades. Now, TSMC is opening a fab in Kumamoto, which is the southern island in Japan. And Rapidus, which is the Japanese semiconductor company, is building a new fab in Hokkaido. So that's a new trend that we are seeing, as Katey said.
That's an excellent point. And I think it's really a great moment to be covering tech in Japan because it is, kind of moment of truth, whether Japan can regain its chip prowess. And a lot of people have faith in this. Even TSMC's Morris Chang said he believes Japan's chip renaissance is on the horizon. So I think 2025 will be a really interesting year to see how Rapidus fares once it starts production, how TSMC's fabs compare to their cutting-edge fabs back home in Taiwan. So now Japan's chip story is really fascinating.
And another sort of major trend that happened during this year was the change or the shift in the EV market. And we, again, published a lot of stories about EV. Is there any comments that you want to make on this EV market? Any stories that you want to recommend?
Oh, what a dramatic year for EVs. I think one of the biggest surprises was that demand didn't quite live up to expectations. There was a lot of hope, a lot of positioning to take advantage of this boom in EV demand, and it just didn't quite take off as much as it was hoped for. Not to say that as a dying market by any means. There's still a lot of activity. China's BYD being probably the prime example. It's outselling Honda and Nissan. It's challenging Tesla as, a pure EV maker. So it's a very dramatic year, and I think we're going to see more of that going next year as well as more subsidies and support for EVs come into play. At the same time, it's been kind of rough going in Europe for Chinese makers, facing a lot of political pushback and, again, slow demand, which is hitting everyone. In June, we had a story on Great Wall Motor shutting its Europe headquarters. In October, we had a scoop about Chinese EV maker Esvolt also shutting its European operations. So I think seeing how they bounce back, or if they can bounce back next year, will be a big part of the Chinese EV story.
Yes, agree. And another interesting thing about the EV market is that the Chinese EV makers are entering Southeast Asia, where it used to be the main battleground for the Japanese auto companies. So the Chinese EV makers are coming into Southeast Asia and they're grabbing the market. So that's another interesting thing. And we are recording this podcast on the 18th of December. And Nikkei had a scoop on Honda potentially merging with Nissan. And this all relates to this shift in EV market and change in industry dynamism. So it was a huge year for the EV market. Now, it's been several years since the US-China tech rivalry intensified and US posted various sanctions on Chinese technologies. And this week, we had a brilliant report about Huawei. Do you want to explain a little bit about this story, Katey?
Sure, I would love to talk about Huawei. Always interested in how Huawei's doing. As you mentioned, it's been about 5 years since it got slapped with the first US restrictions and trade blacklisting. And how it's managed to weather that has been a really fascinating look at the effectiveness, but also limitations of sanctions on companies. This year, for example, Huawei kind of stunned the world with, I think it's the first ever trifold smartphone. It brought out the latest version of its Harmony operating system that it says has no US tech. It's free, as they put it, of US interference, which is quite a milestone for a company that up until just a few years ago, was heavily reliant on Android. So Huawei really is a quite fascinating company. Our latest Tech Asia feature is actually a deep dive into not only how Huawei has survived this US crackdown, but how its efforts to do that have lifted the entire Chinese tech industry. Now, of course, the sanctions on chip making and chip tools have curtailed and curbed China's most advanced chip operations. They're still not at the level of, say, TSMC, Samsung, or Intel. But in so many other segments, it's really moved ahead leaps and bounds, largely because of efforts by Huawei to create domestic alternatives to the foreign suppliers it can no longer work with. So in a way, you could say that the US crackdown on Huawei has ironically boosted China's entire tech industry.
Yes, I agree. The feature that Katey is talking about has a lot of data, a lot of graphics, so I highly recommend our readers to take a look at it. And this is becoming more and more difficult these days, but what do you think is the biggest theme for next year, which is 2025?
I think much like this year, there'll be a bit of continuity. We'll see the EV market continue to try and find a way forward, especially with Chinese makers still expanding in markets beyond the domestic one. The supply chain shift, I think, will continue to be ongoing because companies are just so keen to reduce risks as much as possible. And a lot of our industry sources have said that the uncertainty ahead is just their biggest headache, and trying to plan for and mitigate that is taking up a lot of their time, which leads into probably one of the biggest factors will be how Trump manages relations with China, and if that's going to impact, well, of course it will impact the tech industry, but to what extent and in which direction. So I think those are the two trends I would most closely watch.
Yes, brilliant.
Yeah, what about you, Akito? What do you think is going to be?
So again, it's very, very difficult to predict what's happening in the tech right now, and especially the tech in our region. One thing I want to stress is the EV market that you mentioned, and we are seeing a very dynamic industry shifts and mergers. So how would this sort of become a bigger factor in the region? And also the factor of Gen AI. This was a huge boom. Right. And the Gen AI chips are primarily designed by NVIDIA, and those chips are mostly produced by TSMC. This is like the driving force of the new tech industry, and this relates highly into geopolitics and supply chain shifts and the important companies in Asia where we cover extensively. So this will probably become another huge theme for us in Nikkei Asia for next year.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more on generative AI. And AI in general is going to be a really big theme next year, I think, because, as you said, it's driving so much of the investment and market boom today. How long can that continue, especially if there's slower progress on commercializing AI? So that'll be a really interesting topic to watch as well. You're right.
Boom or bust.
Yep.
Okay. So, well, thank you, Katey. Thank you for handling, I don't know how many hundreds of articles this year. But it seems like it's going to be another busy year next year. And I hope our readers will keep on reading Katey's greatly edited tech articles and greatly reported articles. And we will see you all back next year. Thank you, Katey.
Thank you, Akito. And see everyone next year.